Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Australian College of Applied Psychology's inaugural Get Equipped series. I'm Kathryn Fox, I'm your MC for today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on and paying my respects to elders past, present and emerging. It's great to see you, and I really mean that. What a year we've just had. I just had a bit of a giggle looking at my Twitter feed. Someone had put up what looked like a television screen with a breaking news banner, and underneath it says, "Oh, what the F now?" Kind of sums it up, I think. What's that done to us psychologically as a society, for individuals, communities and families? And I think that's a fascinating thought. But also, what do we do about that? And we've got some wonderful people here to take us through that. So the series has been created, in fact, as a way to do that, to give back, to let you enjoy the expertise of the two speakers here and in coming weeks, and to give us some tools to help with mental health. It will be a 4-part series here at the Sydney Startup Hub. And we're going to start today. We've got 2 speakers, and after each of them speaks, we will have time for questions. So please keep that in mind. No pressure. But if you do want to ask anything, obviously it's a great opportunity to do so. And at the end, we'll just do a little wrap-up discussion and then get you on your way, because there has been a slight delay, as you're probably aware. Traffic, yes, we're back. So sorry about the slight delay to the beginning. I'm going to start, though, by handing over to Kathryn Nicholson Perry, who is the college's Chair of Discipline, Psychological Sciences. She's going to talk to us, indeed, about the role that psychology plays in society, and how awareness surrounding mental health has increased. And as a journalist, I'm so aware of that in the media coverage of mental health, which I think is a marked change from even 5 years ago, and a good thing too. So could you please welcome Kathryn?
Everyone, thank you very much, Kathryn. I'll just get the little clicker. So I hope everyone is equipped. You've all had some caffeine this morning. It's nothing like a bit of a shot of caffeine to get us started in the morning. So before we dig in, what percentage of people do you think would have experienced a mental health problem at some point in their lifetime? If you had to put a figure on it, what do you reckon? 1 in 4? Okay, well in 2002 in Australia, the figure was 1 in 2. So if you think about that and you look around the room this morning, that's an awful lot of us, right? But probably not many of us say much about it in our day-to-day lives. And one of the big issues that we have in relation to mental health in Australia and around the world generally is the stigma that it carries. So I'm not, I'm not afraid to admit that that's something that's affected me and my family as well. And having that lived experience, I think, is really important to underline just how significant this can be and really understand what it's like to walk in those shoes and deal with those problems. But it's not just the effect that it has on us as individuals, it's also the cost to our nation. In the productivity report on mental health last year, they estimated that it might be upward of $200 billion a year that mental health issues cost this country. We could do a lot with that money, right? We could do all sorts of interesting things with it if we weren't having to spend it on mental health care. And also, just in the COVID-19, I think everyone's more aware of mental health issues than ever. So some work that's been done by the Australian government last year, just tracking mental health issues amongst the population, suggests that in November last year, something like 1 in 5 people were experiencing high or very high levels of psychological distress. That's the kind of psychological distress that might make it hard to get out of bed in the morning or go to work or stay home and work. Or, maybe you are working, but you're not working as productively as you could because a lot of your emotional and cognitive load is being taken up by dealing with whatever it is that's troubling you. And perhaps even more worryingly, 1 in 3 young people, so we're talking about 15 to 24-year-olds, people with disabilities and people who are caring for others were affected. So that's, there's some parts of our community who are disproportionately carrying the weight of mental health problems. So I think we've all seen public health come into its own in this last year, right, with COVID-19. The Australian system has done incredibly well at dealing with COVID-19 with a whole bunch of different public health type measures. So looking at prevention, promotion of good health, and then dealing through contact and trace processes with any outbreaks of COVID-19. And that really contrasts with how we deal with the mental health crisis that we have, which is more of a wait for the car crash and then blue light them to hospital and try and put the pieces back together again. But there's certainly been some attention paid to the idea of having a public mental health response. So that is really emulating what we see with public health in infectious diseases, which really involves anticipating the kind of things that might happen to us, so rather than being taken surprised by them. So things like, you know, with climate change, for example, that we know there are going to be more sort of wild weather events. We know those things are coming. We don't know quite when, but they're not a surprise to us when they come. So we can actually get prepared for some of those things. We can plan, we can rehearse, we can look at how we can inoculate people, for example, through mental health literacy interventions. You know, how do you know if perhaps you are experiencing a mental health problem? I think for many of us who have experienced that, it's a real shock when it first happens, and you don't know what to make of it. You don't know why maybe your sleep is disturbed or why you're losing weight. You might think it's some kind of physical problem that you've got. So helping people to understand what mental health involves, what kind of symptoms to look out for and how to respond is a really important way of inoculating people against the negative mental health effects of some of these events. But we can also look at creating mentally healthy environments, and I think that's another thing that's really come out of this COVID-19, isn't it? That we've really seen employers start to think about, okay, what do we need to put in place to make sure that we've got a mentally healthy workplace, even if we don't have our employees on site, if they're working from home. It's been a real challenge in terms of working that out. But some of the things that we can do in those environments so that, you know, wherever it is that we're working, things like physical exercise classes happening in workplaces, etc. Looking at how teams are working and allowing teams to make decisions about the best way to organise their working lives, making sure people are in connection and they've got support, they've got people that they can talk to if they have an issue is really important. Now, those of you who are more hard-boiled and more worried about the cash need to know that there's a massive economic return on investment of these kinds of measures. Yes, they cost money, but often you'll get 2 or 3 times the economic gain back from investing that cash into putting some of these things into place. So we stand to gain a lot, not just individually, but as a community as well. But one of the things that I think we really do need in order to make that work is, and I forgot to use my little clicker, there you go. One of the things that we really do need to make sure that we can make these changes is a workforce that's trained to actually be able to deliver them. And by that I mean not just the kind of mental health workforce that certainly I'm very involved in working with, but also the broader workforce. Things like teachers, for example. You know, we know that a lot of mental health issues emerge during kind of adolescence, but do teachers know what to look out for? And do they know what to do if they see somebody either in a crisis or if they see someone where perhaps something is, you know, just the way a child is behaving in class, their attendance, etc., do they know what to do about that? But also mental health professionals, because if we're going to stop waiting for the car crash and blue lighting people and go instead for trying to prevent some of these things from happening, they're going to need to have a somewhat different skill set. Part of that skill set is this idea of putting on your own oxygen mask first. We're all familiar with that. Well, in the dim, distant past when we were last on a plane, right? And they reminded us of that. There's another interesting parallel with the mental health literacy issue in terms of knowing, I don't know if any of you have noticed, but recently they've started saying in those little introductions to the oxygen mask that don't expect it to expand. That's not how it works. And I know there had been various reports of people in emergencies panicking because they thought the bag was going to expand and it didn't, and they thought the bag wasn't. They thought the system wasn't working. So it's a good illustration of how you've got to give people good information. They've got to know what to expect to help them manage with these kind of stressful situations. Now, in higher education, we obviously have quite a significant number of people who are coming through as young people who are in that high-risk group in terms of developing mental health issues. At ACAP, we also have a really interesting group of students who perhaps have had careers in business or something along those lines and have decided that they want to do something a bit different. So they might be coming back with other responsibilities, caring responsibilities, for example. And we also get a lot of students who come to us who've had lived experience, and that's what's ignited in them a passion for these kinds of areas. So they may be living with conditions that may also put them at higher risk of mental health issues. And in the Productivity Commission's report last year, they suggested that all of the higher ed institutions should have a mental health strategy in place to deal with those kinds of issues, not just dealing with them when they arise, but also having a strategy for how to help keep people well. Now, when I did my clinical psychology training years ago, this was not something that anybody talked about, except on the occasion when one of the lecturing staff actually had a manic episode in the canteen. Suddenly mental health amongst therapists became quite a big conversation, but we didn't really talk about what to do to look after our own mental health. It was somehow assumed that just because you were training to be a mental health professional that you were mentally well, and I think we can all agree that there is nothing further than the truth from that. So I've become really interested in this issue, and for a number of years at ACAP I've looked after the students doing the professional psychology programs. And at orientation I've always told the story of going through a pretty nasty year, my own annus horribilis, to quote the Queen, which really made life difficult for me. And I tried to stick it out, and eventually I realised I was probably actually causing everybody else more work than I was contributing, and I took a few weeks off. And I tell the students this story so that they understand that we know that life happens, things happen, and the best thing you can do sometimes is to take time out to look after yourself. But preferably, we can help prepare those students so that instead of getting to that point, they're actually doing things to keep themselves well, both for themselves, but also so once they've got their oxygen mask on, they can do it for those around them. So a project we've been involved in recently at ACAP is with an organisation called Advanced HE in the UK, and they have been running a global project, in fact, including institutions all over the world, looking at how to embed student mental wellbeing in the curriculum. And the way that we've done this is with what we call a common core unit. So it's basically a unit that all of our undergraduate students do. It's one of the first units that they do when they come in. And it's basically focuses on sustainability. So it looks at how people in the disciplines they're being trained in can contribute to the sustainability of our community, but also how to sustain themselves. So we do things like we talk about the science of stress so that they can understand what's happening in their bodies and also in their minds when we're under stress. We talk about the kind of things that you need to put in place to help regulate stress. So really basic things like, making sure you're exercising, making sure your nutrition is okay, making sure you're getting enough rest, things that we take for granted, but they're really incredibly important to help keep us on the right track. And then also things that you can do to help you manage if things start to kind of go off the boil. So things like being able to recognise when something is happening for you, if you're starting to become unwell or if you're starting to become stressed, who you can reach out to get help around that, and some of the sort of self-help type things that you can do as well around things like relaxation. Now, none of this is rocket science, and it's not special to the students. It's the kind of things that any of us can do in our day-to-day lives to, you know, keep ourselves well, but also enhance our productivity. It's really starting to think about exercising our mental health muscles, not just our physical muscles. And this is really something that I guess is about shifting the emphasis to something called mental wealth, rather than just thinking about, let's take a dysfunctional kind of weakness approach to this and just worry about it when there's a problem. Let's instead turn the tables and think about how do we grow the cognitive and emotional resources that we as individuals have and we as a community have. Now, COVID has really got us focused on this, and that's the subject that we're worried about at the moment. But as I mentioned before, things like climate change mean that we will have lots of things that stress us in the future. There'll be personal things, but there'll also be things that stress us as a community. So what does the future hold? I guess what I'm saying is that we need to start to take a long-term perspective of this. We can't wait for the accident to happen and then respond. We need to be proactive and think about what we can do to protect ourselves and keep ourselves functioning at our absolute best. And we also need to think about it on a community basis, not leaving it to individual people or making individual people, if they get on well, feel like they're the ones that have failed. This is a community responsibility. A lot of the structures, the political structures and the social structures around us are very important to our mental health. So that might mean things like, you know, building in things that grow mental health, grow mental wealth. So embedding into school curriculums things around mental health literacy so that kids understand what's involved and what they can do to look after themselves and look after others. It might mean making sure that we're growing mentally healthy environments. There's a lot of work at the moment around mentally healthy workplaces and things like using things like the Accidental Counsellor that Jane will be talking about in a minute to make sure that we've got systems in place to support people that we work with. We've all got little electronic devices. I'm addicted to my Apple Watch now. So there are lots of electronic ways that we can nudge ourselves to do the things that we know are good for us. I have a little reminder when I should be winding down and getting ready for bed, or, you know, just reminding me to stop and take a breath, or go and stand up and walk around. All of those things that they're tiny things, but incrementally they actually contribute to our mental well-being. And the other thing that I think is really important and we've become really aware of during COVID-19 is just how much it disrupted access to mental health services, which were largely face-to-face, individualised, costly. I mean, you only need to think about, any of you who've got health insurance, have a look and see what your health insurance covers you for psychological treatment-wise. It doesn't go very far. It might cover you for a couple of sessions. And last time I looked, that is not enough of a dose for an effective intervention. So we need to look at digital ways of delivering those kinds of interventions. And there are places like MindSpot, which is a federally funded website that provides online free access to evidence-based psychological interventions for a range of people. And last, I'd just say we need to make sure that we're training people, whether it's people working in mental health or people working in all walks of life, to be able to be ready to do the things that we need to do to keep our community happy and healthy. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kathryn. Do we have any questions from the floor? Don't be shy.
Jane?
Well, I might just ask you, as
Sure.
somebody who's been home-based for the last year, and I am freelance, worked in a newspaper for a long time, but I've been freelance for a number of years. It strikes me that the props that we rely on when we're self-employed are going out, connecting with people, going to meetings, going to forums like this and so on. When that's all taken away, what extra pressure does that apply, and what are the resources that someone like me, or perhaps running their own small business and so on, can use?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think, yes, for sure, if you're a sole trader or a freelancer working on your own, you would feel that very acutely, but I think we've seen that across, the whole range of workplaces and schools, those kinds of things. So I think we have to become much more intentional about planning for connection and community. And I think in many ways we've learnt things about how to do that. That doesn't matter whether we get back into the offices or not, we're probably going to end up doing in the long term, because we've really seen the benefits of it. So as an example, ACAP is a distributed model, so I have teams on 4 different campuses around the country, and prior to COVID we didn't talk that much to each other directly, except in really formal kind of meetings. But now we've got our little team site, we are chatting with each other all hours of the day and night across the entire country, and so in actual fact we've felt a real sense of greater connection across that team as a result. So, and that's something I'm hoping that we can kind of hold on to. But the Mentally Healthy Workplace Alliance actually has a series of resources for people in different employment settings, so sole traders, small business, larger businesses, etc. I think it's a Heads Up web site also gives you the opportunity to use their resources to actually make a plan for how you can keep your work situation, whatever it might be, mentally healthy.
Thank you. I mean, that's such an interesting concept of actually being intentional about making connections. I think it slightly goes against the grain for some of us. It's a bit counterintuitive. So I would normally just have had a chat or a coffee, and now I have to put something in the diary. And I think sometimes that can take some getting used to. Do we have another question before we move on? Okay. Oh, sorry. Yes, go ahead.
Most of it was great, by the way, thanks.
Pleasure.
Most of the stuff was about how we can sort of prevent rather than cure, and recognise things in ourselves, our personal mental health, things like that.
Yeah.
As we were just talking about being in business for yourself, you can end up with a team. Do you have any advice on, identifying that some of your team members may be going through something that's, like you said, we're not good at talking about it. So.
Do you know what? It's almost like you were planted. I'm going to tag team it with Jane.
I was just going to say exactly that. I think, but it's a great question, and of course
That's why
it's our next topic. So why don't I, with no further ado, introduce the wonderful Jane Daisley-Snow, who is going to in fact talk to us about that issue of identifying, but also the concept of the accidental counsellor. This rang a bell with me immediately, where you become the person who's asked for advice or support, and sometimes in fact, Jane, I've often had this, where you've sort of seen someone and thought, oh, are you okay? And when they say no, you feel a bit like a rabbit in the headlights. So that's part of this. But could you please welcome Jane?
Yes, it is interesting that you actually raised that question. I will answer it, hopefully, in my talk. So as Kathryn said, my focus largely is looking at this role of the accidental counsellor, which is a role that people are not trained counsellors, but they find themselves in situations where they're required to support a friend or a colleague or a family member. I'm just scrolling through to get through. That's okay. I'm going in the right direction. Here we go. There we go. Yeah. So I did want to start with some of the areas that Kathryn raised about our mental health in our society, and the statistics that are up there at the moment were taken by the Australian Bureau of Statistics in a survey about how households were managing with COVID. And these were the figures where you can see that young Australians, 32%, and women and people with disability and people who provided care are the ones that have struggled most. And if we think about the impact of what COVID has brought up for us, I'm sitting here listening to Kathryn, knowing that I had to speak, very aware, with the thanks to neuroscience and understanding of what's happening in my own stress response, of a dry throat, heart pounding, and a general sense of being able to, needed to ground myself, needed to be here and be present. So if we think about all the components of COVID, where we're in an unprecedented, uncertain, unpredictable environment, we feel restricted by our circumstances, we're being dictated to by the government that's trying to keep us safe, our own safety levels about this unknown thing called COVID-19 is there. So we've all been sitting in that, stewing in that environment. And this is what starts these psychological stress responses in our body. Our nervous systems get highly activated, whether we're directly impacted or whether we're it's like the field conditions of we pick it up. You've only got to go to the supermarket and be reminded with everyone wearing masks. And for me, it's been alienating to not be able to see people's faces, to be able to smile as my hearing's going as I'm getting older, not being able to lip read as well. So it's all of those things that actually start to create an inner climate that makes us feel uncomfortable, and those very early primitive instincts, our survival instincts, are there. Lots of adrenaline pumping out, lots of things that are then manifesting in our mental health, in our physical health, affecting our sleep. I think about the clients that I've worked with, particularly in the last couple of months, that have having sleeplessness problems, anxiety, existing mental health conditions that have been inflamed in some ways, a bit like inflammation in the brain when we're highly stressed. Financial problems, scared for their loved ones. I have a sister who has children over in the States, one who's about to give birth, So all of these things are there, either whether we're directly impacted or whether we have loved ones or whether we have work colleagues. And this actually, is the climate we've been in and will continue to be in for a little bit longer, because we don't have a bookend to this pandemic. It's that uncertainty, it's that unknown. We've sort of lost ground in some way. And I'm surprised that I've been working from home and in practice, that I've got all the tools, I've got the awareness, but I too have struggled. I've really struggled with feeling flat and feeling sort of a despair for humanity. So I know that everyone's affected. People who've had to lay people off, managers, higher senior managers, they're living with the anxiety of the people that they've had to lay off. People who've lost jobs are struggling to know whether they're going to be re-employed. So this is the climate that all of us need to be attuned to, and this is where I guess the accidental counsellor comes in. But before we go into the accidental counsellor, I wanted to use a lovely quote by Darwin that is in his second book that we're probably not so aware of. We've perhaps all heard The Survival of the Fittest, but not actually heard this one, which is communities which included the greatest number of the most sympathetic members would flourish best and rear the greatest number of offspring. So this is what we saw in the pandemic, where we saw our human to the core instincts, our social instincts, our desire to connect and to have care and compassion for our loved ones, as well as those that aren't within our immediate circle. Edith Cohen the university did a survey of people's concerns for their loved ones and for others. 87% said that they were concerned about their loved ones. 84% said they were concerned for others that weren't within their immediate circle. So that's only a 3% difference. So there is this hardwired core that us as mammals have. Our babies need to depend on us. And we do have all the hormones and oxytocin and endorphins that are regulated. Even with male gay couples, the one that's doing the most of the child rearing ends up having very similar hormonal levels and oxytocin levels to females that are actually doing the breastfeeding. So we know that this is actually hardwired, and we saw a lot of feel-good stories during the pandemic of people looking out for each other, people going to extra lengths. And it is in those early signs of being able to see a neighbour or a friend that is struggling. And we will see this in the weeks and the months and the year to come as we see the fallout of the implications of what we've been living with through the pandemic. So this is where we need to engage our human instincts, and that's the human to the core. So the accidental counsellor is where we need to equip people with the skills to be able to recognise, to be able to respond and to refer. Kathryn's talked about developing training and being able to provide training that has mental health awareness for students that are training to be counsellors or training to be psychologists, training to be social workers. But we also need the same level of training for the layperson, because it's picking up, it's those early signs that our friends and family exhibit that we notice when things have changed. The government's very much for this upskilling of our general population in short courses and micro-credentialing. So people may not have the opportunity to have 3 years training immediately, but they do need to be skilled. And this is where the accidental counsellor skills in, which is a combination of mental health literacy and soft skills. And Deloitte, the economists, have said that by 2030, 2/3 of our jobs are going to be soft skills centric. Yeah? And soft skills are about problem solving, empathy, good communication, teamwork. And this is what we need to build a cohesive, coherent society. So when we think about the recognising, we all have apparently 43 muscles in our face that give us all the expressions that we have, 5 of which, 5 sets are dedicated to us conveying how we're feeling, and also for us to be able to tune in to seeing how others are going. Yeah? We all know with our children or our loved ones when they've had a bad day or when they're struggling. But it's often how do we approach them? We want to. Generally there is, I think, an altruistic desire to want to help people. And that's what they say. Altruism is, it's empathy plus action, a desire to want to make a difference. And this is where mental health literacy, knowing those early signs, are indicators where people might be struggling. Then being able to respond. And this is where sometimes people struggle. Yeah. What do you imagine is going on for the person that is perhaps concerned about their work colleague or concerned about their loved one, but doesn't quite know how to broach the subject? What do you think might be going on for them inside? The reticence to perhaps approach. What might be happening, do you think? Yeah, that I might make it worse, I might say something wrong. Yeah, I think it's that, don't want to bring too much focus that someone might be sort of privately dealing with something and they might feel exposed or vulnerable by highlighting it. Yeah. Maybe that you think that if you do open up the conversation, that they'll start to share stuff that you were just not trained and equipped to deal with, and that you too start to get triggered and overwhelmed. Yeah? So this is where, we need these more nuanced skills of being able to know how to respond. I was talking to my son who's in his 30s about this speaker series, and I said, so how do you respond to your mates that are struggling? In the mateship society of men, they don't have struggles apparently. Not true. But it's this perception that they have to man up and not convey this a lot of the time. So he said, well, I don't use you statements to start with. I said, expand this. And he said, I might just say, just touching base. Just touching base with you. Notice you haven't been your usual self. I know that you've been going through a lot at the moment, that you've lost your job and your relationship's really struggling at the moment. Do you want to catch up for a beer? Go for a surf? So it's those entry points of being able to not just say, how are you feeling, which is, what do you mean, and are you okay, as much as that's really important, and the Are You Okay program is certainly brought up a lot of awareness in community about how to approach people. But it is actually being able to know how to respond. And then being able to refer them on if there are, concerns. And this is where, being able to say, yourself, I know I've been through my own struggles at times, and actually being able to talk to a professional, to be able to talk it through, to get things off your chest can really be helpful. So I think there's been a lot of stigma out there, but it's being able to have these conversations that can make the difference. And so, how do we use these skills and how to show up for another? And it does take being able to be genuine and sincere and authentic. We don't want to be textbooks. We don't want to use something that comes out of a textbook, which some of our students, when they're in the early days, they're so anxious to get it right that they, sound like a textbook. But it's being able to really be sincere with the person that you care about or your work colleague, and be yourself and be how you are in relation to them, that you normally are. To have empathy, which is to be able to step inside their world, their perspective, get away from your own desire to fix and rescue and your own agenda. It's really important to put that aside. The immediacy. There is not one human being that doesn't want someone to give them that direct attention when they're really needing it. We all long for that, I think. A lot of my clients, there's untold stories they've never shared with anyone because they've never had the platform or the safe space or the trust, which is built a long time with therapeutic relationship, to actually be able to really share what's going on. And more than ever now in COVID, there will be those stories. And the openness to actively listen and to be there with an open mind and to suspend your judgment. So this is where we need to bring ourselves forward, to bring our humanness forward, and all the sophisticated skills that you can learn in a training that are really important. But it's in the immediacy with friends and family and that early intervention that we need to step forward. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I was quite mesmerised then. I'm sure we've got some questions from the floor. I did want to just quickly ask you, one of the things that really strikes me about this and actually thinking about this, actively thinking about the role of someone being a counsellor, it must be important also to make it clear to people who do that they're valued, that what they're doing as counsellors to people around them, because it strikes me that happens a lot in the workplace. And there's almost an assumption. I've had a couple of editors say to me, could you go and talk to... And I can assure you it didn't help me get a promotion. I'm not saying it should, but there was an assumption that I would take that role on that I would actually actively go and support, usually a younger female colleague. And I wonder if just occasionally recognising people who actively take that role on is also very important.
Will I respond? Yeah. Look, I think as Kathryn said, a lot of the people that end up being the ones that are there for their friends and family might have had their own lived experience, maybe training to be a counsellor or a psychologist. And I know in my own position that I have to really be mindful when I've in friendships not to step into that counsellor role, because I too have needs and the need for reciprocity in that relationship. So it is, you know, I think that people are, you know, maybe drawn towards being the person that other people feel safe with. A large part of that, I think, is because they listen and they maybe have been through their own troubles and perhaps have shared that. That makes them safe. Yeah. But we need that from upper management levels to start with.
Well, absolutely.
For organisations to change and for others to change, yes.
Yeah. And to really value that
To
role,
value that.
which is a voluntary role.
That's right.
Can I ask the audience for any questions, comments?
And it's the ripple effect that has. The more people that are trained in mental health literacy and these soft skills in all contexts actually start to create a ripple effect, because, and reduce stigma attached to, you know, when we struggle and perhaps need some help.
Also being strategic about it too, I think, in the sense that, yeah, being strategic about it, I think, is really important. You know, you wouldn't have a workplace that didn't have a fire warden or a first aider, for example. But first aiders tend to be trained in, you know, physical first aid, not mental health responses. So, you know, we kind of need to think about that strategically. It's all well and good if your organisation happens to have someone who naturally has that skill set and can be relied on. But that's not good enough, really, in the workplace at this time.
I just wanted to check up the back if this is, if you have any further questions, given you preempted our next speaker. Has that sort of helped with what you were asking before?
Feel free to ask any more questions if you wish to drill down a little more. Yeah.
Sorry.
So, right now, because we're with the sort of work remotely, so how do we put in place a system where we can identify other colleagues that might be struggling?
Yeah, one of the things that we have done is on our little team site is we have a daily check-in channel. So it's not about keeping an eye on anyone in terms of when they start work, because we're a fairly flexible bunch, but it is just about having a bit of a sense of how someone's going, getting people to just put their hand up and say, yeah, I'm here, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. And then if you don't see that, or if you start to notice a pattern that some people have stopped checking in, then at least you can follow up with that. And I think as well, kind of strategic check-ins by managers and that kind of thing. It's that intentionality. You can't rely on bumping into someone in the corridor and seeing how they're going. You've got to find, more strategic ways of doing it, I guess. I'm sure you could. I'm sure there would be. I think it's just those stats kind of highlight the groups that have got that vary from the overall average. So, and obviously within that middle age group, then you've got, you know, people who are carers, or, you know, people from the LGBTQI communities or whatever, who those populations also have higher risk factors. And of course, none of us are just one identity, right? We all have kind of intersecting and overlapping identities. So those risks are potentially cumulative too.
Well, that was Bureau of Statistics.
Yeah,
it will definitely. If
Yeah.
you can bear ploughing through, you will find that.
Oh yes, it's great fun digging your way through the AVS's stats pages.
Entire days can disappear. I may be speaking from personal experience. Have we got any more questions or comments from the audience? Oh yes.
Question for comments. You mentioned first aid, and the thing about first aid is what it gives you. It's not so much the skills of first aid, but the confidence to do something. And the confidence to know that unless you're really calculated, you're not going to make matters worse, you'll always get help. And I see this as something very similar. So going through some core training is enough to give people the understanding that they're not going to make it worse.
Mm.
So it's that confidence that's the important thing, and just having a few basic skills gives you.
Mm.
So I see this as really important in the workplace, that people start to feel more confident that they're not going to.
And there's a lot of feel-good hormones that get pumped up when we give to another, and we feel satisfied in that connection and feeling that we've been powerful in some way, that we've been useful. Because I think that's been another part of COVID, is this feeling that we're powerless to actually be able to help others or to be able to do something that would make a difference. So I think it's training people in those awareness that can affect their, you know, I deal with a lot of teenagers that are really struggling at the moment, worried about the future of humanity. And, you know, just being able to equip them with some skills that Kathryn talked about earlier, about knowing about stress response in the body, knowing about how to, what we call self-regulate, you know, which is what I was doing a lot of before I spoke. You know,
I just went for the coffee.
Yeah, so I think it's all of those levels of training that need to, you know, start very early with kids in schools, to be honest, and high schools, to be able to help them, particularly when they're going through such fluctuations in their hormone cycles as well, that then just, you know, and identity issues. So they really need these skills. Parents need these skills.
There's some beautiful stuff actually that's come out over the last year or so. I mean, I'm from the UK originally, in case you can't tell, and I like to listen to a bit of the BBC in the evening, and they've created a whole heap of resources around homeschooling, but some of what they've created is actually little short snippets of relaxation and meditation resources designed for even the smallest children. So, you know, there's just so much more access to that stuff now if you know where to look.
I like the idea of first aid for the head. It's a great analogy. I'm conscious of time, so we'll just maybe one more question I wanted to ask you. It just strikes me with the comments and questions today. COVID has caused an exacerbation of some issues, but obviously some were there before. Has it perversely also highlighted and elevated the need for some of these organisational and indeed community responses to mental health? Not that I'm wishing a pandemic on anyone, but I'm just saying that there's been...
It's amazing what you can get done by organising a pandemic, though, right? Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. It has really highlighted how critical this stuff is, and what we've got to do now is actually make the most of that bit of the spotlight that we're in, and make sure that some of the kind of key messages get rammed home. I mean, the Productivity Commission's report last year just so happened to end up being released at the end of 2020. And there was already a very strong economic case for investment in this. But I think, you know, people can really see how it's hurting such a wide range of people, how critical it is to address.
Particularly areas around loneliness and isolation that were already there, and people with disability and carers that are really struggling.
Yeah, absolutely. Could you please thank Kathryn and Jane again? Much food for thought. I hope you've enjoyed and got something out of this morning's discussion. I mentioned at the beginning, this is the first of a series of 4 to be held here over the next few weeks in Get Equipped. And just to let you know, the event will be available for download if you go to the ACAP Facebook page. So please go ahead and do that. And of course, any feedback, very welcome. Thank you for coming and enjoy the rest of your day.